Political Poison, Book 2, Paul Turner Mystery. Author, Mark Richard Zubro, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1993. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 5. Turner and Fenwick walked into the Fifth Ward office. Uniformed cops outside, tech personnel inside. Static from cop radios. People murmuring back and forth to each other. And blood on the floor as they crossed the threshold. Speckles of blood at irregular intervals led to the back room. On the rear wall of the former alderman's office, handprints of red streaked down two of the posters, which now featured bloody whales and smeared wetlands. Surrounded by paramedics, Jack Stimson, the media consultant, slumped in the desk chair. Bandages covered the left side of his head. Turner spoke to the uniformed cop who showed up first. Miriam Blackwell, in her early 20s, blonde hair and a ponytail. She chewed on her gum for a minute, then responded to Turner's question. Call came in about 15 minutes ago. Guy next door was washing pots in the restaurant. Heard shouts, then a couple of pops. Said he knew the sound of gunfire. Called it in. We got here, door was open. Neighbors gawking outside. Claimed nobody walked in here. She checked her notebook. We saw the blood, called the tech people immediately. Found this guy on the floor in here. She pointed to Stimson. Refuses to go to a hospital. Not shot, but beat up pretty bad. Why not crawl out in the street for help? Why'd he come back here? Turner asked. Have to ask him, she said. Fenwick jerked a thumb toward the outer office. Anybody out there see anything? Nothing yet. We've got the names down. We're trying to keep everybody in the crowd here. She left the paramedics finish their work. Suggested Stimson see a doctor. He shook his head. They left. Turner sat on the desk. Stimson looked at him through eyes rapidly purpling. What happened? Turner asked. I was working, trying to clean out my files. My work here was done. 3 men burst in here with nylon stockings over their heads. They didn't say anything. I thought it was a robbery, but they simply started beating me. I thought I was going to die. Why did they stop? Fenwick asked. I don't know. They shot a gun off into the wall and ran out. No one else here today? Turner asked. No, I think most everybody went home early. I waited until after the wake started this afternoon to come in. Why crawl back here? Turner asked. I was afraid they'd be waiting for me out in the street. I managed to get to the desk, but I must have passed out. I don't remember anything else until the police came. Why attack you? Fenwick asked. I don't know. It was awful. They asked more questions, but got few answers. Finally, Stimson said, I can't take any more of this. I'd like to leave now. A few minutes later, he was led out by a campaign staffer who lived in the neighborhood. Why this campaign organization? Fenwick asked. Murder's got to be connected to these attacks, Turner said. Who'd they piss off? Who gains by harming these people? It doesn't make sense, Fenwick said. Murder a Chicago alderman and who cares? Doesn't affect the political life of the world much. And as a group, one Chicago alderman more or less is not a huge loss. Turner knew Fenwick's attitude reflected the jaded opinion of Chicagoans toward their city council members, more than heartlessness. Has to do something with more personal, Fenwick concluded. Turner nodded. Agreement. And why murder Giles and only attack these guys? What do they know or don't they know that's keeping them alive? We only think Reichen's still alive, Fenwick said. Or at least he hasn't turned up dead yet. Turner said, we've got to check into their campaign activities, and we've got to find somebody who's an expert on all these groups they belong to. Don't know where we're going to find any more sources, Fenwick said. So far, what we've tried has turned shit. We've got too many people. We've got to begin narrowing this down. The commander walked in. Hell of a mess, he said. Fenwick said, we got shit from that idiot you sent us to in City Hall. One of these days, Fenwick's bluntness was going to cause a big problem, Turner thought. Turner explained what had happened at City Hall. "My contacts at City Hall aren't the best," the commander said. "I agree with Buck's assessment. You got shit. Sorry if they're stonewalling. We've got political problems. This case was screwed up enough before," he harumphed. "I'll try a few other contacts. I don't have a lot of hope." Turner knew the stories about the commander. He had too much skill to be kept out of top positions, but he lacked political backing. He had no clout pushing for him behind the sidelines, and if he didn't have major clout behind you in Chicago, you had to have stupendous skills to move up past the functionaries that filled City Hall. "What happened here?" the commander asked. They explained. The commander agreed the murder, Riken's disappearance, and the beating here had to be connected. Instead of his usual few words of encouragement, he pressed them to come up with a solution. "The press is nuts on this, and whether City Hall wants to help or not, they are saying all the right thing to show excessive concern. I need answers." He left minutes later. Turner has never seen him look this worried. Turner and Fenwick talked to waitresses. They called Mabel Ashcroft, the Alderman's chief assistant, who came to the office and went over the list of socially concerned organizations in which Giles and his people had been involved. They dropped the list off at Area 10 headquarters. On the 4th floor, Turner told Blessing to have his people check all of the organizations for anything remotely illegal or any connection to violence. Back at his desk, Turner found the report from the crime lab. He scanned it quickly. In the fingerprint section, he found what he suspected. The half-open bottle of homemade vegetable brew had only Giles' fingerprints on it. The other bottles included Giles had some random prints, probably from a store clerk. If the murderer had touched them, the prints would probably have been rubbed off as well. Still, they'd try and check them out. Fingerprinting as a method of solving a case was highly overrated. Unless you had a suspect to match them up with, it was virtually impossible to check the ones you had against every fingerprint on file in Chicago, much less with the FBI or any other criminal jurisdiction. Once you had a suspect, they were excellent for confirming if the criminal was there or not. Richard Speck, who killed 8 student nurses in Chicago, left one clear print at the scene. On a door, the print was 18 inches off the ground, a place cops didn't normally check. But the case was so horrific, they checked the entire door, and they did find it, and they got him. It was midnight before Turner got out of the station. He called home around 6. Brian and Jeff were in, since it was a school night. They'd eaten at Mrs. Tolucci's. Brian would have made sure Jeff got to bed on time. Paul pulled into his driveway, turned off the ignition, and listened to the murmurs and clicks of the car settling to a rest for the night. He heard traffic on Taylor Street nearby. A horn honked, a siren clanged in the distance. He looked toward Mrs. Tolucci's house. The lights in the back half of the ground floor gleamed softly through the windows. Paul glanced in, but didn't see Mrs. Tolucci. Knitting lay sprawled on the kitchen table. He knew she must be upset because she hated knitting. She thought it was for old fuddy-duddies who didn't have anything better to do with their lives. He considered stopping in for a visit. He opened the car door, began to get out, then reached back for his briefcase. A shot rang through the night. The glass in the driver's side window shattered. Paul scrambled out of the car and flattened himself on the ground. He peered between the wheels of the car, trying to see where the shot came from. The window in his house, 6 feet above him, slid open. Turner could make out Mrs. Tolucci's and Brian's face in the opening. "Get back!" Paul whispered. The two heads disappeared. Paul crawled behind his car, dashed across the 2 feet to the back of his house, and in the back door, Brian and Mrs. Tolucci met him in the kitchen. "I've got to call this in," Paul said. "They'll be here in a few seconds," Mrs. Tolucci said. Minutes later, 3 squad cars screeched to a halt out front. Another rolled into the alley in the back. 2 unmarked cars blocked the street. Mrs. Tolucci joined Paul on the front porch, talking to the cops. Lights went on in a few houses on the street. Mrs. Tolucci told the officers to keep their voices down so as not to waken the neighborhood. So the men and women of the department spent most of the time whispering in deference to Mrs. Tolucci's commands. 2 of the uniforms hunted in back where they thought the shot had come from. They came back 10 minutes later, reported they hadn't found anything. They promised to return in the daylight to continue the search. Finally, the police left, and the neighborhood returned to normal. Mrs. DeLucci joined Brian and Paul in their kitchen. While Paul put together a late supper, Mrs. DeLucci explained that minutes before Paul drove up, she and Brian had both thought they heard someone sneaking through their connected backyards. Brian said, "I turned on the back porch light and went outside. Mrs. DeLucci told me to douse the light and get back inside. She joined me here, and then you drove up. I checked Jeff. He slept through the whole thing." They discussed the gunshot, and Paul told them about the case. Mrs. DeLucci was firmly convinced the shot fired was an attack related to the investigation. Paul remained doubtful, but didn't contradict her. Mrs. DeLucci said, "I didn't remember the other day when we first talked about it, but I attended a lecture by Gideon Giles when I was at the university." Mrs. DeLucci had gotten her master's degree in philosophy from the University of Chicago while she was in her 70s. "A fool," she declared. "He spoke at some esoteric cross-discipline forum, supposed to be about philosophy and language. He talked about some cause or other." "Off the topic?" Paul said. "Just plain stupid," she said, "and I didn't like him. He smiled like a politician who's been stealing from the till. Most of his campaign staff said he was honest and upright. A couple of the politicians claimed he had to have sold out, but we've got no proof of that." Mrs. DeLucci said, "I've lived in this city all my life. I've read the papers. I've listened to the neighborhood. I know when somebody sold out to win an election. Mike McGee should never have lost." "Who would Giles sell out to?" Turner asked. "Who's benefited the most since he's been in the council?" she replied. "I don't know." She patted him on the shoulder. "It'll take hard work. It's late now and you need some sleep. I'll talk to a few people." Turner was never quite sure about Mrs. DeLucci's connections. Her talking to people could mean anything from being connected to the most powerful mafia don in the country to gossiping with the neighbors. Often, amazing things seemed to get done when Mrs. DeLucci talked to people. Several years ago, a gang of street kids had been harassing older women returning from the Jewel grocery store on Harrison Street. One of the kids had been found hanging naked upside down from the front of the store the day after Mrs. DeLucci had talked to someone. The problems at the store never recurred. The kid was fine, but never said a word about who attacked him. Paul stopped at Jeff's bedroom downstairs before going up. He pulled his son's tangled sheet up over the slender body against the early morning coolness. He sat on the edge of the bed and watched the boy breathe quietly. He touched the sleeping boy's cheek. Jeff sighed and opened his eyes. "Hi, Dad," he said sleepily. "Go back to sleep, son," Paul said. "I love you," Jeff said. Paul leaned over and kissed his son's forehead. "I love you, son," he said. The boy sighed and moments later was fast asleep. The next morning, Brian stumbled into the kitchen, took one look at Paul and said, "You look like hell, Dad." Jeff swung in on his crutches, plopped himself at his place, and opened his math book. He wanted help with some homework. "Why didn't you ask your brother last night?" Paul asked. "I tried to help him," Brian said. "You explain it better, Dad," Jeff said. "And I missed you. I wanted you to be home." This was familiar territory to most comps. Their high divorce rate was a testimony to how the time demanded by their jobs affected them. Paul soothed and cuddled his younger son for an extra 15 minutes and slipped into the squad room late for roll call. When they finished, Turner organized the team for the day. Background checks needed to be finished. Fingerprint reports needed to be gone over. Turner held out little hope for either task being of real help. Paperwork on people interviewed needed to be completed, plus they had more interviews to conduct. "We need to investigate the poison and the vegetable juice," Turner said. "Taste probably disguised the poison," Fenwick said. "Don't know how anybody can drink that shit." "We can try to find out where he bought the stuff," Turner said. "Might give us a clue." Turner called Laura Giles to see if she knew where her husband bought his juice and ingredients. She sounded groggy. Turner gave her a few minutes to wake up. When he asked his question again, she said, "I have no idea. I told you I knew he was into health foods. I don't know anything else." Turner called Iron at 9. His friend picked up the phone on the 7th ring and said, "This better be fucking important." "I have the scoop of the century for you," Turner said. "I don't care. I was up late trying to seduce a 21-year-old college student. The sniveling little creep strung me along for 3 hours, and then claimed he had to go to his parents' home and study for an exam today." "I'm sure you were talking to him in the name of doing vital research," Turner said. "Goddamn wrong. Kid was bright, articulate, witty, and cute." "I'd be happy to discuss your love life," Turner said, "but I'm trying to catch a murderer." "I almost murdered the little creep last night," Ian said. "I need to talk about reform organizations and who's got what power in the city. I need to talk to Marianne Elliott again." "I thought we might set it up for the same time," Ian grumbled. But Turner told him he could sit in this time as long as the whole thing remained off the record. They agreed to meet for lunch. Fenwick came up to Turner's desk and said, "I've got the address of Jack Stimpson, the media consultant. That fucker was lying last night. He knew more than he told. I want to put some pressure on him." They drove to the North Side address. Jack Stimpson and his wife lived in one of the trendiest and most expensive sections of Lincoln Park, on Fullerton Avenue, just west of Clark. Fenwick was pissed about the shot fired at Turner the night before. As they drove up Wells Street, he said, "What the fuck would they shoot at you? How did they find out where you lived? And is it connected to this shit-ass investigation? And why?" "You asked all that already," Turner said. "Double fuck," Fenwick said. "No matter how many fucks it is," Turner said, "we have no way of proving anything now. You know how this is going to go. We have this huge task force of a zillion people. It'll stay in the headlines probably for a good while, because these people are prominent. If we get lucky, one of these millions of useless facts will lead to a minuscule connection. So far, we've got very little besides one dead body, one missing person, and one attack." "What about that kid's room at the university?" Fenwick asked. "That might be connected. I don't know. What I do know is whoever did all this has covered their tracks pretty goddamn well." "I'm worried about the attack on you," Fenwick said. "I've got my vest on. Regulations didn't yet require detectives on the Chicago police force to wear bulletproof vests. All uniformed officers were required to, and many wore them. And I can't post 24-hour guards on the kids. The neighborhood has been alerted, and Mrs. DeLucci said she talked to a few people." "If I was in a fight, I'd rather have Mrs. DeLucci on my side than half the cops in the city," Fenwick said. At the Stimpsons, a butler met them at the front door. They identified themselves and said they wanted to speak to Stimpson. The butler asked them to wait and shut the door. Fenwick said, "I've never seen a guy in a tuxedo except at weddings. Never been to a place that had a butler either. I guess that happens when you deal with a better class of murderer." The butler returned a few moments later to usher them into the front hall. Hardwood floors that looked to have been polished that morning, and a ceiling that soared 3 floors to a massive silver chandelier. Jack Stimpson entered the room a few minutes later. He still had bandages on his head. He sat stiffly as if his ribs hurt. A woman entered the room and stood behind him. She wore a black dress, no jewelry, and little makeup. Turner and Fenwick rose. Stimpson introduced her as his wife, Melissa. She remained standing while the others sat. "I talked to you last night," Stimpson said. "We need to get to the bottom of what's going on," Turner said. "We need your help." "We can't help," Melissa Stimpson said. "I told Jack we should never have gotten involved in local Chicago politics. We've done large media campaigns for national organizations. This city has such an awful political reputation. We know nothing about these people," Turner said. "Maybe you could help me understand a few things?" Before either of them could object, he continued. "Are you saying that Gideon Giles could afford to pay you on the same scale as a national campaign?" "We work in many campaigns. Usually not something as small as a local alderman election, but we've done it." "Didn't you wonder where you could get the kind of money to afford you?" Fenwick asked. "The checks never bounced," Stimpson said. "The payments were always on time. You never know which campaigns will make the most money." Did you work closely with any of the liberal causes Giles championed? Turner asked. No, I was mostly involved with the campaign staff. You know Riken was attacked and is now missing, Fenwick said. We think the attacks and the murder are connected. Neither Stimson spoke. Turner asked softly, What did your attackers say to you last night, Mr. Stimson? Stimson glared at the two detectives. Mrs. Stimson put her hand on her husband's shoulder. They said nothing, he said. Did you know them? Fenwick asked. No, I told you that last night. And why don't you leave us alone? Mrs. Stimson said. My husband told you all he knew. Go away. Politicians had fought to have Jack Stimson to be their media guru. He rarely backed losers and had a reputation for only supporting people whose politics he believed in, as opposed to the usual stereotype of the media consultant selling out to the highest bidder. Now, here was this national figure lying through his teeth, and his wife helping in the cover-up. They must be frightened. Of whom and why is what Turner wanted to know. Can't go away, ma'am, Fenwick said. This is part of a murder investigation. Can't stop until we know everything, Stimson said. The only one in the organization people fought with was Frank Riken. Maybe it was the murderer who attacked him. And now that he's missing, maybe the killer got to him and dumped his body somewhere. I know for sure Frank wasn't one of those who attacked me last night. The detectives left a few minutes later. Frightened, Fenwick said in the car. Scared out of their minds, Turner agreed. But by whom and why? Fenwick shrugged. At 11:30, they met Ian Hume and Mary Ann Elliott at the Melrose restaurant on Broadway. They sat in a back booth away from the early lunchtime crowd. Mary Ann Elliott wore a black blazer, a gray skirt, and white blouse. Ian wore his slouch fedora, which he did not take off even for meals. At 6'6" with bright red hair, Ian stood out in any crowd. Other than the hat, his sartorial splendor was muted. Today he wore black pleated pants, a white shirt, and Chicago Cubs warm-up jacket. The waitress brought coffee. They ordered lunch. Turner explained what had happened the day before when they followed Mary Ann's leads. I'm stunned, she said. My father was definitely covering up. Could you get him to tell us more? Fenwick asked. She shook her head. I doubt it. The old boy network is pretty much tottering these days, but it's still clannish and closed to those who aren't in. I doubt if I can do anything to help you there, but I thought you'd get more information from him. I wish I'd known you were going to visit Martha Chambers. I know her extremely well. If you want to go back there, I'll go with you. That'll help, Fenwick asked. It should. She and I have worked together for years now. You're white males, and that may have been the problem. What is that place, really? Fenwick asked. You mean the building that houses her organization? Elliot asked. Fenwick nodded. It's exactly what it purports to be, Elliot said. She's absolutely trustworthy and a good friend. Turner said, What about the election when Giles beat the committeeman? McGee, we keep hearing about mysterious deals and shifts of power as if we had some kind of banana republic coup against him. How did we find out what the hell was going on? Mary Ann shook her head. Since the first Mayor Daley, some of the committeemen have lost power. Their strength was in providing jobs and services to the people in the ward. The position of Fifth Ward boss didn't have a lot of power, but Mike McGee shouldn't have lost. So you told us yesterday, Fenwick said. That's what everybody says. But nobody can tell us what deal Gideon Giles made or with whom. You've got to offer some people something, Ian said. Money, power, influence, position. Politics is built on who's going to do me some good. So who's got all kinds of good done for them since Giles got elected? Turner asked. No one, so far as any facts on any secret contract deals. Skimming money or buying land based on inside information? Maybe somebody realized he wasn't corrupt. Couldn't believe such a thing of a Chicago alderman and decided to revoke his alderman ID, Ian said. Being an indicted or convicted Chicago alderman was hardly news. Often indicted and frequently convicted of past times, which included bribery, extortion, mail fraud, or income tax evasion. 17 of them have been convicted since 1972 on any number of corruption charges. The voters seldom threw the bums out. Better to know the local clerk than to have him or her sneak around behind your back. That Giles wasn't corrupt was one of his big selling points. Ian said, "Frankly, I find it refreshing to hear that the creep was on the tape." "I thought you liked him," Turner said. "He supported a lot of issues you worked for." "I liked his support on the issues. Him, I could do without. Listening to him for more than 2 minutes was like being beaten to death with an all-day sucker. He was always up, always hopeful, and all those teeth in his goddamn smile needed to be shoved down his throat." Mary Ann Elliott said, "I can try some old friends in the 11th Ward. They may know of some connection I'm not aware of. I'll make a few calls before we go to the South Side." After their sandwiches arrived, Turner asked Ian about the reform groups in the city. "You don't know the impossibility about what you're asking. You start with all the religious crowd, move to the hot topics of the moment, like the homeless. Then you've got all the human rights activists. You've got pro and anti-cop groups. South Africa's been big for a while. Add your endangered animals and plants." "Endangered plants?" Fenwick asked. "Who knows when someone might pull up the last showy lady slipper in Wakanda Bog?" Ian asked. "Wakanda Bog?" Turner asked. "I did an article about them a couple of years ago, connected with how gay groups can network with other rights causes. How other reformers got things done. I do an article. I remember the shit. Besides, the guy in charge of the Save the Lady Slipper crowd was young, sexy, and gorgeous. I found all kinds of excuses to call him. Plus, I got myself onto some of their mailing lists. I'm still on them. Once they've got you, they never let go." "Any of them violent?" Fenwick asked. "They write letters, call press conferences, try to get media exposure. Not a lot of machine gun-toting environmental terrorists. Most of them are middle-class, do-good liberals." "No violence?" Fenwick asked. I thought, "I've never met any I thought would do anything more violent than smash a cockroach, and a few of the groups, not even that much. I could try and find out which ones were most connected with Giles. What have you found among his papers?" "Lots of shit from every group," Fenwick said. "But nothing that show tons of money flooding in." "Most of those groups don't have a lot of money," Mary Ann said. "And most of them don't bother with Chicago aldermen." "He had a shitload of posters up from these groups," Fenwick said. "Collecting posters is fairly easy," Ian said. "What we need to find out is if he had any money coming in from any of them. Or any large sums going to some of them," Turner said. They dropped Ian at the Gay Tribune offices and then stopped by the alderman's office. She left them to make a few calls. When she came back, she said, "Let's try Martha Chambers first." "Did you get any results on Irish political power?" Turner asked. "I called in some heavy markers to try and get people to talk," she said. "As soon as I said a word about the murder, people got real quiet real quick." She pointed at Turner and said, "Several people mentioned the attack on you. Word is on the street that you are not a popular man." "I don't get it," Turner said. "I'm just a cop investigating a murder." "Nothing is just anything in this town when it comes to politics," Mary Ann said. "Whoever was secretly supporting Giles has to be worried." "We don't even know if someone was doing something illegal to get him elected," Fenwick said. "Doesn't have to be illegal," Mary Ann said. "Somebody who is powerful might not want his support for Gideon Giles to get out. Double dealing is a well-practiced art in this city, and violence is not unknown as a way of solving a potential political embarrassment." "Killing me would affect the politics in this city?" Turner asked. "Oh, what you might find out could," Mary Ann said. "Don't take this wrong, but You probably aren't what's important, but what you might find out is. That shot could simply have been a warning to be careful. A note saying keep your mouth shut if you find out something incriminating. Together, they drove to the south side. Outside the five-story building, Marianne Elliott ignored the glass that crunched underfoot, the pavement crumbling beneath her, and the surly teenagers who stepped aside as she marched to the door. The same gentleman who greeted them yesterday smiled at Marianne Elliott, but frowned when he caught sight of the two cops. He ushered them up the grand staircase and to the solid oak door at the end of the corridor. Martha Chambers and Marianne Elliott exchanged hugs and murmured, "It's been too long." Finally seated, Marianne explained their business. Chambers said, "I talked to them yesterday. If I'd known you knew Marianne, I would have been kinder." "This is a murder investigation," Fenwick said. "Withholding information in a case like this is illegal." She wagged a finger at him. "I didn't say I knew anything yesterday. I said I'd have been kinder. Today, I know something. Marianne's presence makes it that much easier for me to want to help you." Fenwick returned her stern gaze. "We're just trying to do a job," he said. She broke off the stare and sighed. "Yes, I suppose you are." She straightened the lapels of her jacket, sat up erect in her chair, and folded her arms on top of the blotter in the center of her desk. She said, "The Fifth Ward should have had a black alderman many years ago. Partly it's inertia. Partly the liberals who represented us always voted our way. A lot of reasons. Then this guy Giles came along. A lot of minority politicians have been looking forward to the day Mike McGee stepped down. We thought we'd have our big chance." "Why not run against him?" Fenwick asked. "It's a lot easier not to run against an entrenched incumbent," Marianne said. "And he'd done a lot of good for this ward," Martha added, then continued. "When Giles came around, none of us in the old guard supported him. We may not have been in love with Mike McGee, but he was okay. We saw the election of Gideon Giles as a roadblock. Then money and jobs started drying up for those who supported McGee." "Who got the jobs?" Turner asked. "City Hall. Politicians don't control jobs the way they used to in this town. But believe me, paying back those who support you is still a big-time business. Mike McGee could no longer pay back. He could no longer serve as clout for anybody. A group of us called on him to find out what was wrong. He seemed as confused as the rest of us. The decision had to be coming from City Hall." "We got nowhere talking to somebody at City Hall yesterday," Fenwick said. "Who'd you talk to?" Marianne asked. They told her. "He's a nobody," Marianne said. "I don't get it," Fenwick said. "I thought Mike McGee was on the outs with the big-time politicians in this town." "Mike knew his place," Martha Chambers said. "He never went so far that they stripped him of his patronage. He could talk a good line in the press, but he was careful never to alienate anyone when it counted." "Do either of you have a solid contact in the City Hall who could give us information?" Turner asked. Both hesitated, then shook their heads. Marianne said, "I could check some sources, but I don't think I know anybody that's high up who could make decisions like this." "I don't at all," Martha said. "Are you sure the murder is connected to Giles winning the alderman's or the committeeman's race?" "No," Turner said. "It's something we haven't been able to get decent answers to. So we're suspicious, but it doesn't have to be connected. Could simply be the politicians in the city being secretive and sneaky with no particular criminal intent behind it. Working behind closed doors is a time-honored tradition in this city," Marianne said. "Wouldn't be odd for them to keep things quiet just for the hell of it." "So, people lost jobs," Fenwick said. "But why did the support dry up?" "No jobs, no loyalty is part of it. The ward still runs on who can get what done, but Gideon Giles started spending money, lots of it. He bought advertising in the black community. He paid volunteers in the black community. He hired an army of people to make phone calls, stuff envelopes, ring doorbells. He paid for a whole precinct organization, almost all of whom came from the black community. People saw that and liked it. That would take a huge amount of money, Marianne said. Why so? Fenwick asked. Marianne said, normally your precinct workers either come from your loyal supporters or people who are in some way on the city payroll. Many of them have been there for years. Many of those campaign workers by night are deep in the streets and sanitation department by day. But McGee would have had most of those wrapped up. Giles recruited new people by the hundreds, Martha said. The old cliche of an army of volunteer workers was almost true in his case, only he did it with tons of money. Who'd he get it from? Turner asked. We keep asking that question. Who was behind him and why? Who benefited? The four of them stared at each other. Follow the money, Fenwick said. We'll have to have some money go over its campaign finances. Everybody goes over those disclosure forms these days, Marianne said. If there'd been something suspicious, surely the press would have found it. Obviously not, Fenwick said. We'll check through it all just in case something develops. The cops thanked them for their help and left. Marianne wanted to stay on and visit with her friend. In the car, they called the station to find out if Roosevelt and Wilson had anything new on Riken. The dispatcher told them to meet the two cops at John Chester's bar, one of the most frequented cop bars in the city. The bar sat on Lower Wacker Drive, where it would have met Madison Street if it had been Upper Wacker Drive. Fenwick parked the car in the dimness, and they walked to the door. The sinister depths created by the tunnel-like effect of the street held little fear for patrons. The bar's reputation kept possible problems in other parts of the city. John Chester kept the outside immaculately clean, the sidewalk swept, the picture window washed. At least once a day on the outside, the room opened out to the left. Rare patrons complained about the dark gloominess of the interior until they glimpsed the mural painted over the left-hand wall, from the front all the way to the back. It looked like an Italian Baroque nightmare. Cherubs and praying nuns abounded on hills and fields, amid enough animals to stock half the zoos in the world. More than one drunk had added splashes of color to corners and crevices of the painting, so that parts had faded erratically. Those in the know ignored the decor and watched the patrons. If they observed carefully, they would see a procession of local, state, and national politicians. One might stop first in the Chicago mayor's office to get an endorsement, but one always stopped at John Chester's in the hope Chester would give his nod of approval. Years ago, he'd been an elected alderman in a huge landslide and then quit 4 years later to open the bar. One of the few probably honest politicians in the city, he quit to keep his integrity. Most candidates walked away from his bar unendorsed and disappointed. The few upon whom he conferred approval cherished the moment. John Chester hadn't backed a loser in 16 years. Turner and Fenwick picked up beers at the bar and joined Wilson and Roosevelt in a booth at the back. Wilson pointed at Turner. Your buddy Carruthers came to us with a big secret today, Wilson said. She laughed. He's not my buddy, Turner said. Told us you were gay, Roosevelt said. Wilson said, we told him that the entire squad was gay. That the city had an affirmative action program for Area 10. That was funny enough, but then I told him that we'd all assumed he was gay too. Poor guy is in total shock. His mouth was open so wide I expected his tonsils to fall out. And they chuckled over this. Turner asked about the case. Roosevelt filled them in. We talked to Riken's parents. According to them, Frank told them about big problems in the campaign organization. Claims their son said they had huge divisions and big fights. What about? Turner asked. Strategy and tactics, being politically correct or expedient, getting something accomplished or being ideologically pure. Riken claimed that members of the organization were close to being the thought police and that no one could ever get anything done because they were blind to the way politics really worked. Fights like that aren't unusual, are they? Fenwick asked. Wilson said, half the do-good groups in the city have that happen. Never accomplish anything because they can't get off their philosophical butts. but I think it's a little more subtle than what Rosie said. Only Wilson ever called her partner Rosie. Carruthers tried it once, and Wilson picked him up by the front of his shirt and waltzed him backwards across the squad room. It was her pet name for him, and Roosevelt didn't seem to mind. "We got our own philosopher," Fenwick said. "Have I had to rip your tongue out this week?" Wilson asked. "Only once, and you said you didn't have your iron tongs with you." "That's the way I prefer having my tongue ripped out," Fenwick said. "You may get your wish sooner than you think," Wilson said. "Back to the point. I've seen it happen in a few of the groups I belonged to when I was a kid." She glared at Fenwick. "You will not comment on how long ago that was." "Me?" Fenwick's attempt to look innocent didn't quite work. Wilson continued. "The members argue for hours about philosophy, fight about how to do things and why. Today it's also a lot of debate about being politically correct, but I see that as an extra layer beyond what I'm talking about, although I suppose any of it is equally good at paralyzing groups. So nobody's got anything done, and Riken was angry about it," Turner said. "More," Roosevelt said. "His parents claimed he told them that Giles had slowly gotten rid of people who got things done over the past 6 months. They say Riken confronted Giles about it." Roosevelt described what the parents had told him. Riken stormed into the office and confronted Giles with the information. Supposedly, that's what the big ruckus was the other day, and that's why Riken was fired. "Riken had figured something out," Turner said. "Information that was enough for him to get beat up, run away, or get killed. We've got to lean on all those campaign people. And find all the people who got fired in the past 6 months. Hell, the past year," Fenwick said. "Not that we had enough people to interrogate already." Turner had a thought as they walked toward the door. He pulled Fenwick aside. "I'm going to ask John Chester if he can find anything out about the politics of all this." "Do you think he'll help?" Fenwick asked. "We aren't friends, but at least I can ask him. We're desperate enough. What could it hurt?" Turner asked Chester if he could speak with him privately. They sat in a booth in the back. Turner explained what he needed. At the end, Chester shook his head. "I don't know much about the politics in the Fifth Ward. I'll ask for you, but I can't promise anything." Turner asked him to do what he could. At 3:30, Turner and Fenwick walked into the Fifth Ward offices. Audrey, the receptionist he'd interviewed the other night, greeted them. Turner saw that her eyes were still red from weeping for the recently deceased. She greeted them by saying, "This place is a mess." She pulled out a tissue and blew her nose. "Gideon dead, Frank missing, Jack beat up. I tried to stay at the wake to comfort Laura, but I couldn't. I just don't believe all this." She waved a hand at the mass of clutter on top of her desk. "This is all so useless." Fenwick picked up a couple of the papers on the desk. "What are these?" he asked. "Telegram, notes, messages from all the groups we ever helped, from politicians, even from foreign countries. Gideon was known everywhere, and now he's gone." Tears escaped her lips. 5 or 6 people in the office stared at them. Hank, the legislative assistant, walked over. He saw Audrey and suggested she take a break. Audrey walked to the ladies' room and slipped inside. Hank said, "It's been a rough time for all of us." His eyes, too, looked bloodshot from lack of sleep and recovering from the tragedy. "We need to talk to everybody," Fenwick said. Hank said, "It's terrible that you haven't been able to catch anyone. We can't figure out why somebody picked this organization to terrorize. Everybody's scared. We wanted to get a full crew in here today, but most everybody is too frightened. People are afraid they might be next." Turner said, "You didn't tell me Frank Riken was unpopular the other night when I interviewed you." "You asked about fights. I didn't know they fought." "Why was he unpopular?" Turner asked. "The woman hated, well, that's too strong a word, disliked him a lot. He'd ask them for dates, and he'd be pretty ugly about it if he got turned down. He thought he was God's gift to the female." "What do you mean, he got ugly?" Turner asked. "He'd be impossible to work with, give short, unhelpful answers to questions, mutter under his breath about what a treat they were missing. He was a superb organizer, or Giles would have gotten rid of him long ago. Anybody talk about filing harassment suits against him? Turner asked. Not that I know of. I think after a while the woman laughed at him behind his back, but he was pretty persistent. You also didn't tell us about the fight between Giles and Riken, Turner said. I heard Frank wanted to move on to greener pastures. I didn't know they fought, Hank said. They interviewed the other women in the room, and Audrey, again, before they left, they confirmed, some of them reluctantly, that Riken had been a sexist jerk. Why didn't anybody put a stop to it? Turner asked. Audrey said. He was so inept at asking women for dates. He didn't take no for an answer. Kept hinting about what we were missing. Thought he was quite the ladies' man. Don't know anybody who actually went out with him. He was a joke. They didn't know about any fights recently and agreed with Hank that Riken left because he had a better job offer. Audrey said, We told you all of this the other night when you interviewed us. Why are you asking again? Because something about this organization doesn't make sense, Fenwick said. Everybody talks as if everything was sweetness and light, and the only problem was a slightly oversexed guy who nobody took seriously. And yet one guy's dead, one's missing, and one's beat up. Riken's parents said Giles and Riken had a fight. None of us knew about it, Audrey said. Then asked, You don't think any of us killed him? That's what we're trying to find out, Turner replied. Mabel Ashcroft, the chief of staff, entered. She saw the police and made a slow trek across the room to where they stood. She gave them a listless handshake and led them to an inner office. She put her elbows on the table and rested her chin in her cupped hands. This is hell, she said. What is? Turner asked. I haven't slept in 24 hours. I just spent 3 hours with Laura Giles. We used up 3 boxes of tissues. Gideon is dead. Riken is God knows where, and Stimson is hurt. A couple of days ago, I was in an organization on his way up. Now it's all gone to crap. People keep calling asking for 1,000 petty things. All the stupid groups we used to help want to know what's going to happen to them. You'd think they'd have the decency to wait until we buried the man. Why not close the office? Turner asked. We debated it, but some of the people thought it would be better to try and keep busy. I don't know if it was the right thing to do. I'm not sure there is anything right left to do anywhere anymore. And I'm scared. There's a killer out there, or killers, maybe stalking me, Fenwick said. We're working on that right now. We heard Riken and Giles fought in the days before the Alderman was murdered. Frank was a sexist fool, but a harmless one. He was always eager to have a demonstration, a march, set up a picket line. He thought those were actions that made a difference. And sometimes they could be a help to a cause, but he persisted and badgered Gideon let him go. But I wouldn't call it a fight. Certainly there were no harsh words while I was around. The cops tried a few questions about Stimson. Ashcroft said, You went over this stuff yesterday. I've got nothing new to add. I'm more tired than I ever thought I could be in my entire life. I'm going home and take a pill and try to get some sleep. One last thing, Turner asked as he stood in the doorway. She gave him a weary look. Is there a health food store around here that Giles used to go to? Ashcroft looked slightly startled for a moment, then replied, He always went to the same one, I think place on the east side of Harper Court, downstairs level. Turner and Fenwick left with little to add to their meager store of knowledge. They stood on the paper-littered sidewalk outside the campaign headquarters. Fenwick gazed at the kids playing on the swings in the play lot across the street. The temperature held in the low 50s, gray skies, but little chance of rain. They drove to Harper Court. The owner of the health food store, Henry Buckman, a man who looked to be in his early 30s, with brush-cut hair, was effusive and friendly. Sure, I know the Alderman, he said. Come in all the time. Always friendly. Came in the first time 10 years ago, just after I opened the place. Usually bought juice. Always bought his weekly supply of vegetables on Monday mornings. Mixed and made his own special blends. Wanted me to try some once. Took a sip. tasted awful. So he was in this Monday? Turner asked. Sure. I remember he talked about helping us keep the court cleaned. I'm always here in the morning, so I know. Buckman told them. Giles always brought 5 bottles of health food juices, always different, and a selection of vegetables that varied every week. In the car, Fenwick said, Not much help. At least it gives us a cutoff. Killer couldn't have put the poison in before Monday morning, Turner said. Killer could have broken in during the night, Fenwick said. Among the myriad of reports we've gotten is one from security at the university. No break-ins of any kind on campus for the 48 hours before the murder, and none in the English department for 3 years. Must you read all those reports? Fenwick said. Habit, Turner said. I'll try stopping. Who's got keys to the place? Fenwick asked. Janitors and security. They've been interviewed. Nobody saw anything. All keys are accounted for. Only Carruthers would think it was a revenge-crazed janitor, Fenwick said. Turner sighed. At this moment, I am dry of notions. Interviewing these politicians would make me jaded if I wasn't jaded already. Do any of them tell the truth? I doubt it, Fenwick said. The part that astounds me is that nobody knew Riken and Giles fought. I don't buy that. Why protect Riken? Turner asked. It does make sense. This whole thing doesn't make sense, Fenwick said. Turner picked up his notebook from the dashboard. He slowly perused the pages, trying to find some link they hadn't tested several times. He tapped Fenwick's shoulder and pointed to a name in the middle of a long paragraph. We haven't talked to Lilac Ulstergaard? Laura Giles' best friend? I'm ready to bat my head against a brick wall, Fenwick said. Where to? Turner consulted a list at the back of his regulation blue folder. He found the address and gave directions. She lived on the east side of the ward. For those who thought of Chicago's south side as a large ghetto with the university stuck in the middle, Lilac Ostergaard's neighborhood would have been a revelation. On street after street, the homes were substantial, with well-tended lawns. Fences protecting most of the homes testified to the high crime areas around them. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.